And I'm going to have you start with your name and, 1 second here. Yeah, if you can just start with your name, birthday, and then branch of service that you were in.
My name is Olive Amelia Merrill Britt.
And your birthday?
My birthday is September the 26th, 1923. And I was born in a little town in northeast Mississippi called Iuka, Mississippi.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then what branch of service?
Oh, I was in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps at first. It was the very first unit that was formed of women in the Army in World War II. And they didn't know how we were going to work out. In fact, we were attached to the housekeeping headquarters company because they didn't know where else to put us in a separate battalion. There weren't that many, but there were all ages from 21. You had to be 21 to enlist. And there were people in their 40s and 50s. There was one, she was a dentist's wife. Her son had gone in the military, been drafted, and she came in as a volunteer to help out. And in those days, there were so few men before computers. In those days, before computers, there were very few men that could type or take dictation. It was, they were in offices stumbling around. They didn't know what they were doing. They typed with 4 fingers, and they didn't know how to file. Well, in those days, in my growing up years, a woman, all you were allowed to do would be a nurse or a school teacher or a secretary. That was the jobs that were assigned to women before World War II. So when I went in, my father had mortgaged our farm for $500 and sent me 35 miles away to become a secretary. And in 9 months, I learned, and I was a pretty good typist. So I took tests and wound up in Washington, D.C., and I worked for the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. My job was, it was at night, and my job was to type Hitler's speeches after we had interpreters and translators. And the translators would take a recording of Hitler's speeches. When it was day there, it was night here, so we worked at night. And the translators would translate the speeches into English, and they would record them on the little wax cylinder disc on a spindle. Well, then they would rush them into us, and they considered me in those days a fast typist, 55, 60 words a minute. But I had really worked at getting that skill. So I was one of the ones that was assigned to these little discs, and you worked them from the floor on a treadmill like a sewing machine. And I would type the speech with the little earphones, and these interpreters from all over, all nationalities, would be there waiting, and there were always older men in dark suits smoking cigars. And there you are typing like mad, and they are grabbing turning the cylinder of the typewriter to see what the next sentence was. And that's my memory of those things. Well, I did that, and I wanted to go in the military when they formed it, but they would not release me because typists, secretaries who took dictation and so on, were scarce. And when they finally released me, and I couldn't go in the service, if you were under 21, you had to have a parent sign for you. Well, I enlisted. I went to the Pentagon and was sworn in. And I left there in December, I think it was, of 1943. And the last thing I remember seeing as we went on the bus to basic training was Jefferson Memorial. They were just finishing it up. That's how long ago I was there. And so we went to Fort Oglethorpe, we trained, and from there, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. Then we went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and they were in the process of closing that. So from there I was transferred to Camp Stewart, Georgia. Camp Stewart, Georgia was a heavy-duty anti-aircraft base. The 90, 95, and 105 millimeter bomb guns were being practiced every night, and the hearing was unbearable. One boom after the other. The ground would shake. And we worked there and in offices. And the men were not glad to see us because that meant that they were being replaced from a very safe job to go and fight. And I remember that we were so short of office personnel that my first job, I replaced 2 men 1 week apart. They were both in the office, but they did not know office procedure. So it was easy to do. One was named Kehoe, K-E-H-O-E. And the reason, there's an incident later with Kehoe. But Kehoe was sent overseas, and then Sergeant Clapper, the sergeant major, was there, and he was sent. And so I had learned that and applied myself so I could do that with no problem. It was easy enough at the front of the office, right outside the general's office. It was easy to do, and so I was there. Sergeant Clapper and Kehoe both left. Very, very upset that I had replaced them. So we typed, and we took dictation, and we did this, and we did that. That was at Camp Wheeler, Georgia. Then the war in the European theater drew to a close, and we got to march right down the streets of Macon, a victory. It was so wonderful, and I thought, now this is going to end all the wars. We've learned our lesson. Everybody, the world has learned their lesson. There'll never be another war. We can live in peace. Well, I liked the military, so I stayed in. And I was transferred to Fort Knox, Kentucky. Tanks. And when I got there, the very first morning I walked in the snack bar and somebody yelled Merrill. That was my maiden name. Somebody started, I didn't know a soul. I'd arrived at midnight the night before. And this guy jumps up and runs over, and it's Kehoe, the guy I had replaced. He says to me, Merrill, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I was just transferred here. He said, have you been assigned a job? And I said, no, got here midnight. And he said, you've got to replace me. Said, you replaced me once and sent me over to fight. Said, now you got to replace me so I can go home to Kentucky. So right then, he said, I want you to come meet my boss. I work for a psychiatrist, base psychiatrist. So I said, okay, it's all right with me. So we went over there, and the psychiatrist, a white-haired elderly gentleman, because I was so young, and yes, you'll do fine. And he called my commanding officer, WAC commanding officer, and asked for me. And she was flabbergasted. She had not seen me. I had not been assigned anything and already had a job. So she agreed to that. So that was a fun job. All the guys wanted to go home, and any excuse whatsoever, they would come. They had backaches, and they had this problem, and they had that problem. Well, the psychiatrist would ask them all these questions, and I was sitting there taking dictation and everything, and he was such a nice human. We repainted our suite of offices, and he wanted to know how I was getting to and from work. And I said, I walk. And he said, oh, we can't have that. I'm going to request a Jeep, and you can drive that Jeep. So he did. So I got a Jeep. And somebody from the motor pool would bring me my Jeep every morning, and I would drive him to the motor pool, and then I had that Jeep all day to go for lunch and so on and so forth. That's when I fell in love with my Willie, little Willie. And as I said, it took me 64 years to get that thing. Do you know, right after the war, they had those Jeeps in boxes, disassembled, big crates about the size of a car. And you could buy one at the military auctions for $75 and put it together.
No way.
A mechanic could put it together. It was that simply made. Well, when you think of what I've got in mind, it's embarrassing. I've got to confess, Zach, when I get up there, I've got to confess to my husband that I spent $35,000 on a $75 ice. Well, the Army doesn't know this, but I learned, they taught me on the side to drive a tank. You know, the Caterpillar tanks? See, they wouldn't teach us to shoot. They wouldn't let us go on bivouac. They wouldn't let us do the obstacle course. And the obstacle course, you know what that is, do you?
No.
It's where you crawl along the ground at night with 21 inches above you, bullets flying.
Okay.
And you teach yourself that if you come to a log or an obstacle, trash, or a little mound, you crawl to the end and go around. They would load us up on those big, huge trucks, and they would take us out there, but they would not let us do that. They thought women could not do any of those things. Today, it's an accepted thing, but we were a novelty. A lot of the men, officers, and the enlisted resented us. They couldn't figure out, we were so new. And we were the auxiliary at first. Well, after about a year, they decided we were working out and could fulfill a job and help with the war effort, even though it was so safe and so boring. Type, dictation and type. And service records. They were the size then of little passports. Each word had to be printed with ink in there painstakingly. Each important, they were a record of the soldier's life. And each item had to be carefully printed in there. It was a very slow procedure. We could have won the war in half the time had we had computers. Well, we could have done it in 2 years. But as it was such a slow, tedious, day by day and night by night. Sometimes we would work troop movements, going over, they get partial pays. And in order to do all that, you'd work like 10, 12, 14 hours a day. But it was nothing compared to those men going and dying. Some of those men I knew, and there was a camaraderie there with everybody. Some of them would send me little gifts when they first went. Little silk handkerchiefs and little cushions and little souvenirs, and they would write. And back then, you didn't need a stamp. You could just write a letter. It was free. If you had a military address, you didn't need a stamp for your letter. And they would write to me, and I would write back. And then suddenly, after a battle, I would never hear from them again. They were dead. They were killed, you see. So that was sad, and it bothered me, but it was the job that had to be done, putting their names down there and sending them off. Well, and there was a difference in an enlistee and a draftee back when I first went in. The older men looked down on the draftees. They would come in and be furious that when you typed payrolls, and the payrolls were painstakingly typed, their serial number, their military address, and their name in order. And at that time, if you were a enlistee, you had 10 cents a month out of your pay was automatically deducted to go to the old soldiers' home. Now, that is what they call the VA now, you know. And it was an honor for that distinction to be made and to be considered an enlistee, not a draftee, you know. You only came because you had to. And they would be infuriated. They were so proud of the fact that they were given a dime each month to go for support of the old soldiers' home, that they would be furious that I or one of us had forgot to deduct that dime. That was really, really sad, and it's hard to believe that. But I encountered it day after day, and occasionally you'll forget to put that dime deduction down there. So,
Wow.
Anyway, went to Fort Knox, and on weekends, I liked the motor pool, and I liked eating out. And the guys I knew, I met some guys who drove the tanks, and they offered to teach me. That was not allowed. A woman could not possibly get in a wheel vehicle and turn a wheel and use signals. Well, I went out there, Fort Knox. Went out to Fort Knox, and I hopped in one of those tanks, and and you lower yourself in. And you sit down there, and there's a wheel, and there are signals on the side, and a little key, and off you go. And it was fun, and I went weekend after weekend, and I mowed down trees. At Fort Knox, there are thousands of acres up there. Mowed down trees, and eventually they gave me a license, tankless license, but that was undercover.
Wow.
Until today, the Army doesn't know that I learned on their time how to drive one of those tanks.
Wow.
They just were so negative. Well, you see, that was before World War II, and women were not supposed to do those things.
Yeah.
I could do any, and the sad part is when I went in, I hated the typing and the shorthand and the desk paperwork. But once I put down what I did and what my skills were, they wouldn't even let me take a test to train me to do anything else because it was so important. The build-up of paperwork was mind-boggling because with all the increased numbers of the men that were needed, they generated paperwork. So that's how we got our foot in the door. And I enjoyed the military. My favorite thing about the military was reveille, and then at 5 o'clock, what do you call that? At 5 o'clock when they play taps. Anyway, when I was assigned to flag detail, I totally loved flag detail. Two people, two-person. You go out there and you lower the flag, and then you'd never let it touch the ground, and then you fold it. And of all the things I did in the military, other than the behind scenes, like the tank and the huge trucks, I guess it was, I think, 4-ton trucks at the motor pool, the guys would let me drive them forward and backward. They wouldn't let me take them out of the motor pool area, but they let me get in, and I could drive them to the edge of the motor pool, and then I could back them. But I feel so held down now when I see these girls flying, and oh, I envy them. Oh, I envy them, and I would love to have made it a career. I would love to have been a lifer, they call it. But my husband didn't like that. Now, I met him 2 years after I was in, and we got married, which was a scandal, a disgrace for military people to marry. They didn't want that done at all. That was really a bad thing.
You want to retell the story about how you guys met? And
You want me to tell that again?
yeah.
Oh, all right. But anyway, I've still got my tank license. So I was one up on them. And then we were transferred from Fort Knox, Kentucky, some of us, to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And they told us then, you know, I had this secret clearance all along since I was typing those Hitler speeches. And let me go back to that. I'd get off work about 7 in the morning. Hot in here.
Here, let me.
Let's open the door. Could we do that?
Yeah.
Oh, just
Open
put
the windows there.
I'd get off about 7 in the morning and walk 3 blocks, and I lived at the YWCA, 3 blocks, and from where I worked. And they had, at that time, movies, little shops set up where they showed reels of the war, how the war was progressing. And for 20 cents on, every 3 or 4 blocks, there was one of these little places where they showed the reels, old-fashioned reels of how the war was going. And I would stop in to see the news because we didn't have television. I didn't even have a radio in my apartment, in my room where I lived. And you could stop in and see the news, the planes and the ships that were sunk and so on and so forth. And it would be stuff I had typed 1 night or 2 nights ago. See, and at that time, I took it for granted. You just did. You were doing what you could toward the war effort. Our country was in great trouble. So later on, people say, oh, what did you do? And thinking back, and I'd try to say just in an ordinary conversation, and they said that was the most exciting thing of all, you know, that I did. And so let's see, how did I meet my husband? Went to Fort Bragg, and on like Friday night, and Sunday morning, Easter, I was walking from the women's barracks over to the airport to see if I could get a flight. I was in full uniform, and this soldier stopped, was hitchhiking, long way to walk, didn't have to. And I was hitchhiking, and this soldier, MP in a Jeep, stopped and said, what's the trouble, Sergeant? And I told him I wanted to ride to the airport to see if I could get a ride back to Fort Knox, so for the day. So he said, well, if you'll come and have breakfast with me in the mess hall, I'll take you over. And I said, okay. So I did, and he did, And I told him bye and thanked him, and I went off, got a flight, went to Fort Knox, had a good day, checked on my pregnant dog I had left up there. They wouldn't let me bring her with me, wouldn't provide her with military transport. So I had to leave her there, and a stray that I had felt sorry for. So that night when I came back, it was about 9 o'clock, and this same soldier, Air Force guy, was there, military, and he greeted me, and I was so surprised. But I still thought, well, it's a coincidence. He's checking the airport rooms and stuff, waiting rooms. And so I went with him. He said, I'll give you a ride home if you'll stop by the club. So I did, and then we sat there and had a sandwich, and he took me to the barracks. And I thanked him again, said goodbye. And the next morning at breakfast, he was in the lunchroom, in the mess hall. And he started appearing everywhere I went. He'd pop up, George Britt. And 2 weeks later, he asked me to marry him, and he was drinking. And I said, okay, any day now. And the next morning, when he was sober and in the mess hall, he said, we set the date. If you set a date, picked out a date. And I said, what? And then he explained to me a marriage date. Couldn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe he remembered it. It was so ordinary then for the guys. And I'll tell you a little story about that in a moment. Not a story, truth. And so that went on for 6 months. It took him to save money to buy me a set of rings. So we met on Easter Sunday, and we got married, Chapel 13 at 5 o'clock on October the 5th. And that lasted 44 years in 2 months. And it was just like yesterday. Anyway, the early part of the war, and then when I went in, I didn't go in at the beginning because they wouldn't release me without a replacement. But when I could, I did. And you'd be standing in line. The only thing to do in the afternoons or at night after you got off work, on the days you didn't work long hours, was go to the movies. They were 10 cents. Any movie, Errol Flynn and all those old movie stars, 10 cents. And you'd stand in line, and there would be maybe 100, 150 of us in line, men and women, and you talked to each other what you did and so on and so forth. And a casual 10-minute conversation, and they would ask you to marry them. It was sad. It was heartbreaking because these young men knew they were destined to go overseas and be in battle. And they wanted to leave a wife behind. Mm-hmm. It was so sad. And one night I'm standing in line and we were talking front and back. And this guy, Italian, nice-looking young Italian man, asked me, we'd been talking about 5-10 minutes, and he said, would I consider marrying him? And I said, no. But he said, that way I'd have a wife, and you could go live with my parents in Wisconsin. You could go live with my parents in Wisconsin, and they have a wine cellar. And then when I come back, if I do, we'll have a happy life. That went on all over. I knew a young woman who married a guy that asked her like that from Fort Bragg, and he went and overseas, and he was killed, and she married another one. Now, she did it for the money because you automatically were granted a $10,000 insurance policy if you got killed. So that was sad, but it was an experience that happened often. Yeah. Everyone was so afraid. Sometimes you didn't voice it. And now it's so discouraging to think that the rest of our lives we're going to be worried with threats and in danger of being attacked. Now, my Jeep, I got to tell you this about my Jeep.
Yes.
I had friends, and at night, when after the war you didn't have to work like 12, 14 hours a day, you got off at 5 o'clock. And we decided that after the war, when we all got out, there was really 4. Miller, Boo Boo, Caledonia, and Iuka. They call me Iuka after my hometown. We started skating, and we went to the skating rink, and we did a lot of fun things. And we decided we were going to buy a Jeep, and the 3 or 4 of us, Miller wasn't too enthused, but the 3 of us were going to go take a Jeep trip across the country. Well, we even signed a pledge in blood. We went and sat in the bathroom on a bench, and we pricked our fingers and signed it that the 3 of us were going in a Jeep that we owned across country on a tour. Well, I got the Jeep, and I've lost the contact with the girl, and I don't know if I want to go alone. It wouldn't be any fun. So that is sort of the story of the Jeep.
Okay. And what year is the Jeep?
The Jeep's 1942.
1942.
It's a 42. And
It's an Army Jeep?
it's an Army Jeep, and it was made by Willys, Willy''S. Mine came off the assembly line according to the inscriptions and the dates and stuff. It came off the assembly line before May, because after May, they not only Willys Car Corporation sold Willys to Ford, and they kept the name, but it was Ford manufactured. And when they sold, the trade was done, the sale was completed, the Ford Motor Company immediately started making switch-on ignitions. And that's how I know, because I've got one of the last ones that came off the assembly line with a key. There.
Oh, cool.
And I so wanted to stay in. I so wanted to stay in, but my husband didn't. Yeah. Immediately after we got married, he wanted me to get out, and I said no, I don't want to. So I did stay in 2 more years, but the Army did not like a husband and wife to be stationed together on the same base, just like they wanted to torture you. And so they were going to transfer one of us somewhere else. And my husband so wanted me to get out and start a family. So finally I agreed with him. And so then I became a housewife, and I hated it. And I raised 2 kids. And then my husband retired with his 30-year service, 100% disabled. And then I took care of him until he died. And all the time I had these guilt feelings, but I'm thinking of a Jeep. So when the opportunity came, I got my Jeep.
I love it. It's a cool Jeep, too.
Oh, I love that little Jeep. I'm going to get it to working, get it in working order. But you see, my friend with Alzheimer's, and I was his sole caretaker. I couldn't walk off and leave him, Zach, because his children wanted him dead. And when the moment they found out that he was worth $1 million in savings and accounts and stuff, they wanted him to die.
That's a shame.
The daughter was very angry with me because I kept giving him medications. She told me to stop giving him medications, and I would not. I could not decide when someone should die.
Right.
So she was really upset with me. But the last 2 years, he was from Texas, and he was not the type of person that would do well in assisted living. He fell and broke his hip and was in the hospital, and he wouldn't listen to anyone, and they wound up restraining him with tying his arms to the side of the bed so he couldn't get up. And he would not have lived very long in assisted living. Very nice, kind, sweet, independent Texan. And it became so bad the last couple of years that he couldn't button his shirt, and he was really helpless. He couldn't remember, and it got worse and worse and worse. But he did know me to the very end, and I could not walk off and leave him. And his children would say, one son, one daughter, they'd say, well, Olive, anytime you can't take care of him, we'll put him in assisted living. Well, I couldn't do that. So I stayed to the end, and I'm glad that I did it. I don't regret it. That was 18 years we enjoyed most of that traveling. It was fun, but I still have traveling and shooting in my system, in my blood.
And when did you learn how to shoot again?
I learned how to shoot, and I was about 75. No, older than that, maybe 80. 80. And I took to it. I really enjoyed it. Target practice. Got pretty good.
Yeah.
Got pretty good. I hit the 9 or 10.
And what kind of guns do you have?
I had a Windmaster 44 and a 44, and then I had a 22 Browning that was issued to this man that I bought it from right after he graduated from West Point. So it was worth a lot of money. I got that one, and then a couple others, but the only one that most of them I bought as a private sale, no record of them among friends or something. But the only one that's registered in that I gave 4 of them to my older son, and I still have my 38 S&W. Oh, that does shoot it's trigger quick. He was a gun mechanic as well, and he worked on the trigger quick. You just squeeze it.
That's
just
amazing.
touch it, and it goes. Oh, I do enjoy that. I still would love to go shoot, so I've got a lot of rounds of ammo. I didn't give that to my son. It's too hard to come by, and I would love to go shooting. Oh, I just love it. That I enjoy as my hobby. That.
I'd love to go with you sometime.
Do you shoot?
Yeah.
Do you really?
Yeah.
What do you shoot? What do you have?
Well, I've got a Smith & Wesson 9mm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Automatic.
Semi. Yeah. But I just got that maybe 6 months ago.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
How about the long ones? Do you shoot any rifles?
I haven't shot any rifles, but...
No, I never did shoot. I so fell in love with the handguns that I never got around to letting Sammy teach me how to shoot the rifles.
I'd love to try it, though.
Shotguns.
Yeah. That's the only thing I've tried is the handguns. I've tried a 6-shooter and the revolvers, but yeah, the place that I've gone, you can rent them, so you can try out all different types that you want.
That's good. Well, you know, going inside, we used to go to Shooter's Paradise when it rained in the winter, and I so enjoyed it. We'd go over to Oxnard to Shooter's Paradise, and the gun smoke would be so thick in there, and as you know, there are little booths, just like in a bank. You just pull up there, and you never know who is going to be in the next booth
Right.
with a ready gun. And when you turn, I've seen them when we were taking, I took 4 courses, one right after the other, from Sammy Topo's beginner classes for future policemen and for guards. And I have seen some of the ladies who were in law enforcement or in different aspects where they needed to be aware and have a gun or be at least knowledgeable in how to shoot. And it was their first time on the range. And when they would speak, they would turn, they would have their hands, and if something was said, they'd turn their guns with their body. And that's scary.
Yeah.
That is just downright scary.
Yeah.
So not me, because I'm careful. The men that taught me to shoot up there, they oftentimes wouldn't have to say a word. They'd just look at me. One was a highway patrolman who was assistant range master. And all he'd do was just look at me and move my hand like that. And that was chastisement that I didn't forget, as you know.
Yeah.
Safety first. And you got to figure out on where it's going. Where it's going.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun.
Oh, I did. I really enjoyed that. We'll do it sometime if I live long enough.
Oh,
between trips.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
when are you going? Are you? Is this an expense-paid trip to?
Yeah.
Headlined, Hitler goes into Poland and all these horrible pictures of war where he was invading one country after the other. Really, really scary. As a child, you read that, and it's extra scary.
Yeah.
As a child. And then when it was so close to home and we finally did go in full blast, it was scary. It was an unknown in that we were not really prepared for war in many ways. My husband, as I said before, went in at 17, and when he was doing basic and all, they practiced with pieces of lumber for rifles, the M1 rifles. They didn't have enough to go around, so they cut 2x4s, pieces of lumber, the length of the rifle, and that's what they marched with until the factories could build up enough steam to get rifles to them. So we weren't really prepared. And as you know, off Santa Barbara, there was a Japanese ship that got that far off Santa Barbara. And my husband was stationed in the Aleutian Islands, Adak, Shemia, Attu, on that island chain out from Alaska. And he said one night that one afternoon there was a Japanese warship that came and anchored just offshore. Well, Dutch Harbor, Alaska, is where the Japanese had been entrenched. And just before my husband was sent up there, they'd had that battle and taken it back, and the Japanese withdrew. And they left their dying and dead on the island, Dutch Harbor, and they left, they pulled out. Well then, as my husband was there for a while, and there was this Japanese carrier stationed just off in the fog afternoon. And they were so worried they would be attacked during the night. And everybody armed themselves with weapons, even knives, butcher knives and everything. They were going to make a last stand, and no one slept during that night. And the fog comes in so thick and so heavy that you can hold your hand at arm length and you can't see. And in the morning, the Japanese destroyer was gone. And my husband said, "Wow, That was the biggest worry I ever had in my life. Let's go. Let me show you my house.
All right.
How are you holding up?
I'm good. How are you?
With all my crap.
That's great. I love it.
Well, you know just about my whole life.
Well, it's a very exciting, interesting life.
It was sort of day by day. You do what you got to do when you got to do it. You know how that is.
Oh yeah.
And when you're in the middle of it, you don't think about it as being exciting. You just want to get through and do the best you can.
You're right. Which way am I going here?
Oh.
Right.
Right.
Now tell me one more time. How old were you when you got the tattoo?
I was 80.
80. Was that on your birthday?
Yeah, it was on my birthday, on my 80th birthday, and Sammy, my man friend, went with me and my younger son. And Sammy was so upset that I was getting a tattoo on my body that he wouldn't stay when I went to the tattoo parlor. Where did I go?